Imagine a world where war was not only fought in battle, but carried step by step, mile by mile, every single day. Picture an army so immense that if you stood at the rear, the beginning of the column would already be far beyond the horizon. But this was not just a line of men with weapons. It was an entire city on the move. A city of soldiers, yes, but also of kitchens with smoke rising in the dawn air, of medics treating wounds before the march began, of engineers hauling heavy tools and equipment, and even merchants walking among the ranks selling bread, wine, and supplies to soldiers with coins to spare. What we are about to see is the Roman legion on campaign, not in the heat of battle, but in its daily march, a machine of flesh, discipline, and iron that advanced across continents with the rhythm of inevitability. To understand, it is to glimpse the secret of Rome's power. And by the end of this journey, one question remains. Could you survive even a single day walking alongside the legions of Rome? The first step to grasping this machine is to face the numbers. They were staggering. During the height of the Roman Empire, a typical campaign force often consisted of 2 full legions, somewhere between 13,000 and 14,000 highly trained legionaries. These were the professional soldiers of Rome, men hardened by years of training and campaign. But they were not alone. Alongside them marched 5,000 to 6,000 auxiliary troops, specialists recruited from all corners of the empire. There were Numidian cavalrymen, unmatched in speed and maneuverability, Syrian archers whose bows could reach targets far beyond the javelins of Rome, Germanic infantrymen with raw ferocity, and Hispanians who fought with deadly skill as slingers. These men were not Roman citizens at first, but they fought for Rome in exchange for pay, plunder, and the promise of citizenship once their service was complete. Add them to the legionaries, and suddenly the force approached nearly 20,000 trained fighting men. But even this was only the beginning. To keep the great serpent of Rome alive and moving, another army existed within the army. 3,000 to 4,000 cooks, servants, slaves, and laborers. These men and women were the hidden backbone of the march. They prepared food, repaired weapons and armor, tended to wounds, set up tents, cared for animals, and built roads or bridges when the landscape demanded it. Some were enlisted auxiliaries assigned to logistical duties, while others belonged to the officers themselves, private retainers who traveled wherever their masters went. Then came the animals, as essential to Rome's advance as the soldiers themselves. A single marching force might require 4,500 to 5,000 mules to haul equipment, not counting the horses of officers, cavalry units, and mounted messengers. Each beast could carry up to 130 kilograms of weight. Wooden stakes for fortifications, sacks of grain and salted meat, siege tools, iron nails for bridges, even disassembled catapults waiting to be rebuilt at the next camp. Add all of this together, and what emerges is staggering. A marching army swelled into 25,000 to 30,000 living beings on the move, men, mules, horses, carts, oxen, and weapons stretching across the land like an endless tide. And this number didn't even include the civilians who followed Rome for opportunity. Merchants, blacksmiths, local guides, prostitutes, and messengers moving back and forth between towns and forts. Polybius, the Greek historian who witnessed Rome's might, described a legion on the march as a moving wall of flesh. And he was right. A single marching column could stretch for 8, 10, even 12 kilometers down a road. At times, the head of the column might already be fording a river while the rear was still striking tents from the camp of the previous night. The scale created problems unlike anything a smaller army ever had to face. How do you move such a beast day after day without it collapsing under its own weight? The answer lay in discipline, timing, and an organization that transformed chaos into order. The Roman march began in the darkest hours of the morning, between 3 and 4 o'clock, during the 4th watch of the night. The first sound was not of clashing swords, but of hooves beating softly into the earth. These belonged to the speculators, Rome's elite scouts and eyes of the army. More than simple riders, they were trained to detect ambushes, read the lay of the land, investigate villages, and evaluate the safety of routes ahead. They rode out under cover of night to ensure that when dawn came, nothing stood in the path of the advancing serpent. Back at camp, the silence was broken by the deep, resonant blast of the cornu, a curved bronze war horn. This was the centurion's call to rise. At once, each contubernium, a unit of 8 soldiers who shared a leather tent, sprang into action. Nothing was improvised. The tent was dismantled, equipment packed with practice speed, weapons inspected, armor straps pulled tight, sandals checked for wear. And most important of all, each man prepared to carry his world on his back. Roman soldiers had no wagons for personal belongings. Every legionary carried between 20 and 30 kilograms of gear. His shield, sword, and javelins, cooking pots and tools. 3 days of rations, usually in the form of dry bread, salted pork, or hard cheese. Wooden stakes for fortifications. A pickaxe or spade for digging. Rome's soldiers were not just fighters. They were engineers, carriers, and builders of empire. At the same time, the high command gathered to decide the day's route. The legatus legionis, military tribunes, and engineers studied reports from scouts and messengers, debating which paths to avoid: swamps, rocky hills, valleys vulnerable to ambush. Their goal was always to keep the column moving swiftly and predictably, but never to leave it exposed. Meanwhile, in the supply lines, order reigned. Mules were fed, carts inspected, gear strapped into place. The impedimenta, the supply train, was organized with the same precision as the troops themselves. One mistake here could halt the column, and halting meant danger. By the time the sun began to rise, the head of the column was already on the move. There was no noise, no songs, no idle chatter. Discipline was absolute. The legions marched in silence, their sandals striking the earth in steady rhythm. Rome believed that no one should know the army was approaching until it was too late. At the very front, where danger always lay waiting, marched the vanguard. This was not a random band of scouts, but a deliberately crafted force, designed to be fast, flexible, and deadly. Rome knew that one surprise attack, if it hit the column unprepared, could mean disaster. The vanguard was therefore made up of Rome's fiercest auxiliaries. Light cavalry from Numidia and Thrace, masters of quick strikes across rough terrain. Gauls with hunting instincts and keen awareness of the wild. Archers from Crete and Syria, capable of raining death from a distance. Alongside them were light infantry, unburdened by heavy armor, ready to sprint, strike, or retreat at a moment's notice. Their task was to secure the road ahead. They cleared ambushes, dismantled traps made of logs or hidden pits, searched through villages that might conceal enemies, and fought enemy scouts in deadly skirmishes when necessary. Yet their job was not simply to fight. They were the eyes, ears, and alarm system of the army. In the dense forests of Germania, visibility was poor and danger constant. The vanguard often marched as far as 3 kilometers ahead of the main body. That distance was vital. It gave them room to send signals, request reinforcements, or retreat if overwhelmed, without throwing the entire column into chaos. Roman historians like Tacitus and Vegetius wrote of how essential this structure was. If the vanguard was lost, panic could sweep down the line like fire, shattering Rome's discipline and ensuring catastrophe. That is why only seasoned veterans were chosen for the vanguard. These were men with years, sometimes decades, of campaign experience. They had earned the right to lead the way, and they carried the responsibility of the entire legion on their shoulders. They knew they were the first to tread into danger, the first to face death. And they also knew that if they failed, no one behind them would have the chance to react. This was the Roman march, not chaos, but deliberate, disciplined motion. Tens of thousands moving as one, a city on the road, a serpent of steel and flesh, bound together by routine and iron will. It was not simply the strength of Roman swords that built an empire, but the ability to move this machine day after day across mountains, rivers, and plains, unyielding, unstoppable, and inevitable. Right behind the vanguard marched the quietest, yet most decisive men of the Roman column, the agrimensors, the military surveyors. Their role was far more crucial than their simple tools might suggest. Armed with instruments like the groma, used for measuring straight lines and right angles, and the chorobates, employed to determine precise levels, they carried out tasks that could decide the fate of an entire campaign. These men were trained topographers, specialists in transforming unfamiliar and often hostile terrain into secure and orderly military camps. Before the first tent was pitched, before the first shield touched the ground, they had already marked the exact coordinates of where the legion would rest. With stakes, ropes, and solar alignments, they defined the outline of the castrum, the fortified camp constructed at the end of every single day. Precision was everything. The chosen ground had to meet near mathematical standards. Access to a clean water source, soil that was firm and well-drained, an elevated position for visibility, nearby forests or quarries for timber and stone, and, ideally, an open field for immediate deployment if battle came unexpectedly. All of this had to be determined in just a few hours, because a legion halted without a camp became an exposed and perfect target. Close to these surveyors marched the command nucleus. The legatus legionis, the highest-ranking officer of the legion, did not walk among the ordinary soldiers, nor did he rest comfortably in the rear. Instead, he occupied a central, strategic position within the column. Here he remained accessible yet protected, surrounded by his personal guard, military tribunes, and a team of administrative officers. From this nerve center, crucial decisions were made. Alterations in marching routes, responses to reports from scouts, last-minute adjustments for difficult terrain, sudden weather shifts, or unexpected enemy movement. Orders flowed outward from the center like blood through arteries. Mounted messengers, the cursors, galloped from the commander's post to the front, the flanks, and the rear, carrying coded instructions. Trumpets and cornu blasts signaled changes in pace, halts, or alerts. Everything depended on precision, speed, and discipline. Ancient writers, such as Frontinus, emphasized how the choice of campsite could determine victory or disaster. A field that drained poorly could turn a swamp in a single storm. A hill left unoccupied could provide the enemy with a devastating vantage point. A shallow river might fail to protect the flank. Rome understood these realities, and so this routine was performed every single day with exacting care, as if war itself had been scripted from the very first step. At the heart of the column marched the main body of the legion, the living mass of Rome's military machine. Here were the seasoned veterans who had marched and fought for years, the fresh recruits still learning discipline, the stake carriers who bore the wooden palisades used to fortify each knight's camp, and the tool bearers who carried the implements of construction. These were the men who physically carried Rome on their backs. A legion typically consisted of around 13,000 heavily armed legionaries, divided into 10 cohorts, each further divided into centuries of about 80 men. Alongside them marched thousands more servants, slaves, muleteers, and animal handlers, adding another 4,000 people to the moving city. And among them were thousands of mules, each beast of burden loaded with over 100 kilograms of essential supplies. What made this force remarkable was not simply its size, but its discipline. Every man, animal, and cart had a place in the column. Veterans were placed at the front to set the pace. Raw recruits marched in the middle, bracketed by experienced men who maintained order. Those known for trouble or indiscipline were placed at the rear of the main body, where they could be closely monitored by officers. The formation of the march was not a battle line. Instead, the column stretched into a narrow band, only 2 or 3 men wide, perfectly adapted for the rugged terrain of valleys, mountain passes, and ancient pathways. Mounted messengers constantly rode back and forth, relaying orders, while blasts from horns carried commands down the line. But none of this could have worked without one essential element: the weight every soldier carried. Each legionary bore between 20 and 30 kilograms of equipment. This included armor, often the Lyricus segmentata, though chainmail was also common, the large rectangular scutum shield, the deadly gladius sword, a pilum javelin, wooden stakes for fortifications, a shovel, cooking gear, a water flask, spare clothing, dry rations, and personal utensils. Because of this immense load, they were mockingly nicknamed Marius's mules, a reference to Gaius Marius, whose military reforms had established that soldiers must carry their own gear. The legion's pace was strictly regulated, 20 to 30 kilometers per day, never more, never less. To march farther risked exhausting the men and leaving them vulnerable. To march less slowed the campaign and exposed them to danger. The rhythm was sacred. If a soldier collapsed, the rules were stark. If help could be given quickly without disrupting the march, it was done. If not, the fallen man was left behind. Efficiency was valued above compassion. Behind the disciplined corps came the lifeline of the army, the baggage train, or impedimenta. This was not an afterthought, but the logistical heart of the legion. Within it traveled the grain and salt, barrels of vinegar to preserve food, construction equipment, disassembled artillery, scrolls with maps and orders, spare tents, clothing, cloaks, blankets, footwear, medicine, and every other supply required to keep the legion alive for weeks without external support. Hundreds of carts and pack animals carried these supplies, each carefully loaded. The carts were reinforced with thick timber, fitted with double wheels and leather-bound axles, designed to withstand punishing roads. Skilled attendants guided them, some enslaved, others hired, and many had been with the Legion for years, knowing the routine as well as the soldiers themselves. Yet for all its importance, the baggage train was painfully slow. That is why its position within the marching order was carefully chosen, often placed at the center of the column or directly behind the main body, shielded by the rear guard and watched over by flanking patrols. A single broken axle, an injured mule, or misplaced load could delay the entire march. Historian Josephus, writing of Titus's campaigns, noted that the rules governing the baggage train were as strict as combat orders. Supplies could not be touched without authorization, and disorder was punished swiftly and severely. The impedimenta carried more than supplies, it carried people. Medics marched with portable surgical kits. Cooks ground grain with small mills and prepared meals in portable kettles. Blacksmiths traveled with their tools to repair weapons and armor. Scribes recorded the day's movements. Interpreters were present to translate local languages. There were even spare animals ready to replace those that collapsed. Protecting this train was so important that in hostile territories, whole detachments of cavalry and light infantry were assigned exclusively to its defense. Because if the train fell, the legion itself could not eat, could not rest, and could not fight. The world's most disciplined military machine would be reduced to a starving, chaotic mass. Finally, at the end of the column came the rear guard, the invisible shield of the Roman march. This was not a punishment, but a duty. The men assigned here were seasoned soldiers, drawn from auxiliary archers, cavalry, and infantry. They protected the baggage train, collected stragglers, guarded the flanks where visibility was poor, and reacted to surprise attacks. The threat at the rear was not only physical, it was psychological. A sudden strike from behind, even by a small enemy force, could trigger panic and spread rumors throughout the column. A scream at the wrong place or a misinterpreted horn blast could unravel the order of the entire march. That is why the rear guard was constantly rotated, its soldiers kept sharp, disciplined, and alert. It also served another purpose, enforcing discipline. Deserters often tried to slip away at the back of the line, but they were usually caught here, and during desperate campaigns, many were executed on the spot to preserve order. This was the Roman march. Not just an army, but a city in motion, a machine of flesh, iron, and willpower. Every movement, every order, every placement was calculated. From the surveyor's stakes to the commander's coded signals, from the veteran setting the pace to the rear guard keeping watch, it was not chaos, it was Rome advancing. Discipline in the Roman army did not end when a soldier stepped out of formation. It was not something that could be shed with the armor at nightfall. It followed him to his very last step, woven into the fabric of his existence as a legionary. History had taught Rome, often through blood, that the slightest lapse in discipline could lead to catastrophe. The most brutal reminder of this came in the year 9 AD, in the dark and suffocating forests of Teutoburg. There, 3 Roman legions under the command of Publius Quinctilius Varus were utterly annihilated by a confederation of Germanic tribes, led by Arminius. It was not a single strike that destroyed them, but a relentless combination of flanking assaults, rear ambushes, and the suffocating trap of the forest itself. The columns stretched too thin, coordination between vanguard and rear broke down, and in the chaos of rain, mud, and dense trees, no organized defense could form. The result was Rome's greatest military disaster of the High Empire, a trauma so profound that it redefined how the legions marched forever after. From that moment on, the Roman rear guard ceased to be a passive shield. It became a living, proactive force. Reinforcements, messengers, and engineers were integrated into its structure. The rear did not merely watch for attacks anymore. It anticipated them, ensuring the column's tail could not be cut down as it had been in Teutoburg. Yet the dangers of the march were not only behind or ahead. The most vulnerable points of a Roman army on the move lay at its sides, the exposed flanks of a line that could stretch for 10, sometimes even 15 kilometers. If the vanguard was the eyes of the army and the rear guard its shield, then the flanks were its open wounds. Protecting them required men unlike any others in the legion. These were the flank guards, the silent watchers of the column's edges. They did not keep to the main road. They melted into forests, climbed ridges, scouted valleys, and slipped unseen into villages. They were ghosts, meant to see danger before it revealed itself, and to strike swiftly and brutally if needed. Light auxiliary cavalry often formed the backbone of these patrols. Numidians with their fast horses, Thracians armed with javelins, Iberians skilled at fighting in broken terrain. Alongside them marched light infantry with minimal gear, trained to ambush or pursue enemies through woods and ravines. In territories like Germania, where no Roman knew the land well, native scouts were recruited, men who understood every path, stream, and choke point. Their duty was relentless. They marched farther than the legion, slept less, ate poorly, and lived in constant readiness. A single mistake by a flanker did not simply cost his life. It could open a breach wide enough to consume the entire army. That is why this role was given to hardened veterans, soldiers with years of experience, trusted to act without orders and survive in silence on the edge of danger. But no matter how strong the march's protection was, the day never ended when the sun fell. For a Roman legion, the most exhausting and repetitive operation began the moment the column reached its destination, the construction of a fortified camp. This was no mere encampment. It was the beating heart of Roman discipline and the ultimate expression of order. Chosen in advance by the agritors, the military surveyors, the site had to meet strict conditions: elevated ground, access to clean water, defensible terrain, and resources like wood and stone. Once selected, the transformation began. Thousands of soldiers shifted seamlessly into the roles of engineers and builders. First, the ditch was dug, 2 meters deep, 3 wide, a scar cut into the earth that defined the camp's perimeter. The removed soil was thrown inward to form a rampart, topped with the sharpened wooden stakes each soldier carried as standard equipment. For gates were laid out in perfect orientation. The Porta Praetoria at the front, the Porta Decumana at the rear, and the Porta Principalis dextra and sinistra on either side. Guards were stationed immediately, even before walls were finished, because security came before rest. Inside, the camp unfolded like a carefully drawn map. Officers were housed at the center, surrounded by the tents of regular soldiers. Auxiliaries were assigned their designated zones. Animals were stabled in ordered rows, and supplies were neatly arranged. At the core of it all stood the Praetorium, the commander's tent. Here sacrifices were offered, omens read, and councils of war convened under the watchful eye of Rome's gods. The streets of the camp were always the same: straight, wide enough for troops to march through, and aligned with military precision. Warehouses, kitchens, and latrines all had fixed places. And remarkably, all of this was completed in under 4 hours. Ancient historians like Vegetius and Josephus marveled at this ability. describing Rome's camps as instant fortresses capable of turning open fields into walled cities overnight. Even if the army intended to remain for only a single night, the ritual was never abandoned. To neglect fortification was to abandon the very essence of Roman identity. When the final stake was hammered in, the last tent pitched, and the watch assigned, the camp fell into an eerie silence. But the day was not finished. Night was not a time of rest for Rome. It was another phase of operation. Fires were kept small, just enough for men to grind wheat into porridge or mix vinegar with water for pasca, the sour drink of the legions. Medics treated the wounded, animals were tended, carts repaired. Orders for the next day were read aloud to centurions, punishments were declared, and sometimes executions carried out as grim reminders that Rome's law never slept. Above all, the camp was silent. Rome practiced sound discipline. No singing, no laughter, no careless noise. Even footsteps were muffled. Sentinels rotated every 3 hours, carrying the tessera, the daily password, and presenting it at checkpoints to prove their vigilance. The punishment for failing in this duty was the harshest of all: death by stoning at the hands of one's own comrades. It was brutal, but it ensured that no soldier ever forgot the weight of responsibility. Every man slept with shield at arm's length, sword at his side, sandals ready to slip on in moments. If an alarm was sounded, each soldier knew his exact place, what gate to defend, what formation to take, where to run. The legion was never surprised. It was always the one delivering surprise. And so, a Roman march was not simply a movement of troops. It was a carefully choreographed performance of discipline, survival, and domination. The legion carried its own walls, its own streets, its own laws, and its own gods. Machine, beast, and city all at once. It advanced like an unstoppable force, breathing as one body and rising each night as a fortress. And now, having walked beside this relentless machine for a single day, one must ask, could anyone today endure such a life? Could you survive a week under Roman discipline? Because this was Rome, not just an army, but an empire in motion.